time. Definitely shaped a lot of my interests as far as games, video games goes. I've tried to make my own to varying degrees, and then eventually I just got super into Morrowind modding because that kind of does most of the work for you.
Yeah, I started with D&D back when I was around 11, I think. I was actually yes. To set the time frame, I was introduced to the game when I was reading about the characters playing it in the novelization of the movie E.T.
Oh boy.
It's a science fiction movie that Steven Spielberg made. E.T.
For me, I think I started playing around about the release of 3.5 D&D, which was 2003, 2004. Yeah, that puts it around about 21 years now.
Sure. All right. So, welcome. This is kind of a fairly broad discussion on the relationship between D&D and tabletop games in general and Morrowind, both in terms of the ability to tell a story and gameplay and everything in between. So this will be a fairly open discussion, and I'll just kind of go slide by slide and we can discuss from there. The first is maybe the most contentious one, where you try to define what is an RPG. This is a chart that I made. So to me, an RPG requires two things. You have to have the ability to impact the narrative, and character skill has to be more impactful than player skill. So you have things like JRPGs in the bottom right, where character skill is entirely the most important factor to combat. You're simply selecting things from a menu. If your character has low stats, you lose. If your character has good stats, you win. Your physical ability to play the game has zero impact on it, and that's why, on that axis at least, it's very RPG-like. However, most JRPGs, you have very little, if any, ability to impact the narrative. Now, on the other end of the spectrum, you have things like Souls games, where you can theoretically beat the entire game at level 1 if you are mechanically good enough to do it. However, you do have a little bit of branching stories and stuff, and nice ability to impact the narrative there. And even above that, you have things like text adventures where you're simply typing things in, and your actions are more important than anything else in the story there. And somewhat in the middle, you have Bethesda RPGs. You have Skyrim, which I think has player skill definitely more important than character skill. Fairly low ability to impact the narrative. Oblivion is a little bit better in that regard, and Morrowind, I believe, is the best, at least. They aren't quite there to things like Baldur's Gate and true tabletop games, but they're somewhat in the middle.
Mm. I think it's interesting because Bethesda games, there's an argument of whether they're even trying to emulate tabletop games in sort of whether they're providing an interesting world as a backdrop for the mechanics of the game rather than something to actually actively interact with, because all of these games are relatively static in they're not particularly reactive games when you are, as opposed to a tabletop where you are, as a player, interacting with the world as much as the GM is interacting with the players, in that they will change the world around what the players have done, and the players will change their actions depending on what the GM puts into it.
I think you're inherently limited. I think that this definitely isn't drawn to scale, and if it was, you would see tabletop games' ability to impact the narrative. It would be miles above any computer RPG, because you simply can't prepare for anything that players can do. I also agree in that as far as RPGs go, as far as computer RPGs go, none of the Bethesda RPGs do a particularly good job at player reactivity. You might occasionally have an additional dialogue option here and there, but for the most part, like, you're just selecting which order you want to do things in. Now, Morrowind does have an advantage in that you do get to select a house. You do get to select, you have the occasional quest line that locks you out of the other quest line, like the Fighters Guild, Thieves Guild rivalry being maybe the only notable example there. They did try. They tried a little bit in Morrowind. With Oblivion and Skyrim, there's almost nothing as far as that goes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, in Morrowind, you could break the main quest by killing the wrong NPC. And in the later games, they just made everyone immortal.
That's also true.
And again, that's a sort of sense of one of the attempts at reactivity with Morrowind is that they do have that backdoor through the main quest if you do decide to just kill Vivek as soon as you meet them, which is something that you don't really see in any of the other Bethesda games, where it's very much there is one path through the intent. There's the intended sort of narrative path for you to take, and you don't have any wiggle room outside of that.
Yeah. Ooh, I would say it would be. See, it's a good question. I don't think that you have more ability to impact the narrative in Daggerfall, but player skill is definitely more important, or character skill is definitely more important than player skill. So maybe where Morrowind is, but a little further to the right.
I don't think you have much of an ability to impact the narrative in Daggerfall outside of just breaking it by doing things wrong.
Yeah, it might count. It might count.
Well, it does. well, it doesn't help that at the end of Daggerfall there are 8 or 9 different possible endings, and then Bethesda said, "Well, they all happened," even though they should be mutually exclusive.
Yeah, you kind of have to take the game in a vacuum and ignore the later lore.
With the warp in the West.
Yeah, so if you ignore, like, you'd probably put it below Morrowind in terms of impact, unless you ignore everything that happened after it, in which case you could probably argue that having multiple endings is something none of the other games have, so...
I would say certainly the Souls games are an anomaly in that there's not many other action games that do have branching storylines and the ability to kill any NPC that you want. So they're kind of an outlier in this case.
It's almost considered like a trope of CRPGs, the requirement to have like a lot of reactivity within the RPG sphere. As Mort said, I can't really think of any outside of that have very much reactivity at all, to be honest.
Yes, and that's why I definitely made it a wide ellipse, because some of them are the later Star Oceans, East games. Some of those are definitely a lot more player skill. Of course, at the very bottom left, you'd have things like, I don't know, did they ever add stats to Halo? Maybe something like that would be down there, where you have no ability to impact the narrative and your character skill doesn't matter.
Yeah. Something like Counter-Strike.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. So, I guess we have to talk about what makes tabletop RPGs good. And I've split this into both a few points, both from a creator perspective and from a player perspective. And I just selected three of my favorite ones. I really like Gamma World. I love Call of Cthulhu, and Keep on the Borderlands, classic module. As a creator, tabletop RPGs are good because it's fairly easy to create settings. If you can, if you were literate, you can create a tabletop RPG. At least setting-wise. It's not too difficult. Just think of a plot or a setting, and you've essentially done 50% of the work at creating a tabletop RPG setting. Especially if you are particularly good at writing, you don't even need artwork. Certainly it would help to make it a little more impactful, but that isn't required. And unlike video games, you don't have to know programming. You don't need artists or anything. And it is very easy to write historical events and show them through modules. And I put this as world impacts, and I'll have to kind of explain that. With that, I mean things like, if the player does something, the world can immediately react to it. For example, if you save someone from a town, everyone in the town is now friendlier to you. How are they friendlier to you? The DM just says everyone is now friendly to you. Like, you don't have to go in and manually program every NPC reaction. You don't need to do all this weird specific stuff. Additionally, you could say, if you ended a war. This is the biggest thing in things like Fallout New Vegas, where when you beat the game, you can't even play after it because too many things happen that they didn't have time to program in. With a tabletop RPG, you can just make it up as you go, and it's fairly easy. As a player, you do truly have infinite possibilities, or at least as many as your DM can think of. All of them are inherently multiplayer. I believe that it isn't strictly a requirement in some cases. There are some single-player RPGs, but you can play with basically as many people as your DM wants. And the DM can easily scale adventures on the fly, both in terms of number of players. They can scale encounters to fit your character's skill level if they wanted to. If they want to be mean to you, they could double the number of creatures you fight, or if they want to be nice to you, they could reduce it. And that's something that video games at least, have a much harder time of doing.
Yeah, I don't know if anyone here is familiar with the Knights of the Dinner Table comic book.
Yes.
It's about a group of tabletop role players, and there will frequently be situations where the GM has some elaborate story set up. The players arrive at a city. One of the players takes offense at something one of the guards said as they're coming into the city. They start a fight, and they end up burning the city to the ground or something like that. And then they end up fleeing for their lives and living in a camp out in the woods, and the adventure the GM had planned has gone completely out the window, and that's not something that you can really do in a computer game.
Yeah. It's sort of what I was saying before about how TTRPGs can be properly interactive, in that the GM's able to, if one of the players, maybe the players have just had like a rough week, and the GM could just throw in tone down the difficulty, make things a little bit more light, less heavy, maybe narratively as well. It's that kind of, you can really tailor the experience to what the players actually want in the moment, which is something that, if you hit a difficulty spike in a video game, you've just got to deal with it. If you're not in the mood for doing that, your option is to just not play it. And it's that sort of co-created narrative which makes tabletop RPGs good. Basically, it's that everyone involved is kind of working together to make this as enjoyable for the players and for the GM to run.
Yeah, like the DM can certainly cheat some rolls to make it more exciting one way or the other. Whereas in a video game, oh, you can't unlock the door? I guess you're stuck. I guess you're stuck.
Console.
Yep.
What you were saying, Jackimoff, about how the players can react to each other and the DM can react as well. I think that's why in Morrowind I absolutely adore having companions, especially if they start bugging out, because to me that sort of emulates the player that's with you when you do tabletop, and you don't control what they do. And I think that's why I like to have my companions. Just they can be really buggy, and that's the best part, because things happen without me making them happen, and without the game making that happen either, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
There's a lot of reward in that emergent gameplay, where you are just reacting to things that are happening it's probably the appeal of like roguelikes, is that you are generally just reacting to entirely random scenarios, and the whole deal is that everything that's happening to you is completely unexpected and possibly not even what the developer intended, and you are getting the joy out of just reacting to this completely unknown situation. And why that feels like tabletop RPGs is because that is what tabletop RPGs are in their entirety. They just are entirely emergent gameplay. It is the GM just coming up with on the fly. They'll have a general structure, but coming up with on the fly responses to what you did, which are usually responses that you came up with on the fly to what the GM told you, and it just keeps cascading like that. And how you can wind up hiding in a cave because you burned a city down or something like that.
The downside of that, of course, is if you're maybe in a new group and you don't know each other, or the DM is unsure, because a lot of the fun comes from reacting to what other people do. It can fizzle as well if you don't know your co-adventurers very well, or if you're, I don't know, just tired even.
I think that ties into Mort's next slide pretty well.
It does. What do video games do better? So maybe the best thing that they do better from a creator perspective is you can force the players down these preset paths. For better or for worse, you can prevent the player from doing things that you don't really want them to do, or don't expect them to do, by simply either not making it possible or greatly incentivizing it one way or the other. The additional advantage, at least from the player perspective on that end, is that you can reload a save if you do something bad. If you accidentally blow up a town and end up in a cave, you can say, yeah, let's try not doing that, which is great. It's much easier to write focused narratives because, to a degree, the players are forced to read them, and while they aren't forced to pay attention, they are forced to experience them one way or the other. And you can even set up little quest chains where, in order to set up the next path, you can tell them what they need to do next and have that readily available to them. Certainly, I think character narratives in video games are much, much easier to write than in tabletop games. I can't think of many tabletop characters that are super memorable off the top of my head. Just ones that DM made up on the fly, I guess, when they did a funny voice. For the most part, it's mostly about the players and the loot. Another good advantage as a creator is you are literally building the world that the players see and experience. Whereas with tabletop, you have a very low overhead. It can be mostly theater of the mind, where you're just kind of describing a scene and the players close their eyes and say, yeah, I think I see a key on the table. You can physically put a key on the table. You could hide things in the environment that you can't necessarily do in a tabletop RPG. Anyone who's played tabletop RPGs know 90% of the rooms are perfect rectangles with usually very few objects in it, and you just simply roll to see if you find things in the room based on your character's perception. Whereas if you're building a video game, you can make verticality. You can make cool things for players to look at. You can put art on the walls that characters actually can see and experience. The advantages as a player, of course, are you can play it entirely by yourself. You don't have to have a DM. You don't even have to have friends. It certainly helps if you do, but it isn't required. If you're bad at theater of the mind or don't really want to use your imagination that day, you can just look at the very pretty graphics in all of the games. It's also very easy to pick up and play. You don't have to learn rules. The game will mostly teach you very quickly. And there's a sort of shared language between games. Certainly if you play a game like Fallout New Vegas, you could play Fallout 3 or really any kind of action RPG and generally understand what's going on. Whereas with tabletop RPGs, especially between different systems, you can have very different mechanics.
You mentioned the theater of the mind when doing tabletop RPG. Obviously, having a game showing you what's going on is one way to visualize, to have things for you to see. But you can go the other direction and take up LARPing.
Yeah, you could.
Yeah. I mean, to sort of pick up on the theater of the mind thing. There's definitely like that element of in video games there's not going to be any miscommunication. If your GM is not particularly good at, or maybe just failed to do it in the moment to describe accurately a room, it can lead to a lot of confusion where the players are just flailing around. You know, you thought you said that the key was on the table, but none of your players picked up on it, or you explained it poorly, or they just didn't hear you. And so you're wondering why they're like scraping every wall looking for a key that you know is on the table. And it does add a sort of level of interactivity, but also it means that the players, the GM's no longer got that requirement to improvise anything. So you can make a room that would otherwise be fairly inconsequential extremely detailed. You know, as anyone who's run a TTRPG will know, every bookshelf in a TTRPG is filled with books that are entirely blank unless they're useful. And it is a huge advantage of video games in that you can just very, very densely pack the game with detail and reward people for exploring and thinking through that level of detail.
Yeah, a couple of the Morrowind mods I've created have been direct adaptations of published D&D adventures, and one of the difficulties I've had is coming up with how to clutter the rooms to Morrowind level. In the published adventures, it's like, yeah, there's a table and a bookshelf with some books on it, and that leaves a lot of territory to cover. I mean, one of my dungeons, I ended up filling the place with bottles of booze, musical instruments, and all of the vanilla books that had to do with music and songs, just to create a backstory that the villain was an alcoholic would-be musician, in addition to being the wizard that was the main focus of him being the villain.
I guess, kind of going off that point, it's both an advantage and a disadvantage to video games, in that in a game, players expect the books to be more than just blank text some of the time, and you're able to flesh it out if needed. But with a tabletop RPG, you can just say, yeah, none of them are important, and players just accept that as a fact. Like, oh, okay.
I'm thinking of games, video games, and I think more modern games. I feel we have a lot of the eye candy and a lot of the clutter, but it's not really meant to be inspected and looked at. I'm thinking of Fallout, for example. In the very first Fallout game, you would have little description of things. And these, at least for me, were an important part of the game, was reading the descriptions, because they were more interesting than the object itself. And nowadays we have very detailed things to look at. But, I don't know, I feel players sort of just run past because they have their quest marker over there, and there's just no point looking at the details.
That's true. At some point, people just stopped writing item descriptions. I don't know when that happened, but you can definitely remember in Fallout 1 and 2, if you found a tin can, it would say, an empty can that looks like it used to have sardines. It smells faintly of fish.
Yeah.
And nowadays, you just pick up empty can, 0.1 weight, 5 caps or something, and it's like, well, that doesn't tell me anything about the world. It doesn't tell me anything about anything. It's just another item that I'll never pick up again.
Yeah, and it's a place where, again, the Souls games are a complete exception to the rule, in that they are the item descriptions are hugely informative and pretty much the only source, really, of the sort of deeper background information on the setting. And as seen by the incredible amount of videos that are just going off speculating off the meaning of the description of this shoe, like, there is a huge desire for games that do that, and it's confusing to me that it's sort of fallen off fashion when the one game that still does it is hugely popular for that reason.
So are we sorry we don't have item descriptions anymore, or that's just how games are now and we accept it?
That's just how games are, and I think it's only getting worse. I mean, you have games like Morrowind that actually have miscellaneous items, like you can pick up scythes and shovels and things. In a lot of modern games, you can't even interact with those at all. I think in Starfield especially, there's just a lot of items you can't pick up. Your character looks like they could physically pick them up, but they just aren't items. So you can't do anything with them.
Oh yeah, one of the first mods I installed for Skyrim was a mod that replaces all of the static crates and containers that you can't open with actual containers.
That was one of the very first mods, I think, like Fligetti's mod, I want to say.
If you've got a crate or a barrel sitting there and you want to look in it, but you can't.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Maybe it's because we're used to Morrowind and we're used to being able to do that. I don't play other games much, so I don't know. Do other games do that? Like have miscellaneous items you can pick up even though they're pointless and cheap, worthless?
So the latest Baldur's Gate game does that well, and the previous one's Divinity Original Sin. It has a lot of miscellaneous items. Like, one of my favorite things to do in those games is steal paintings, because paintings sell for a lot of money.
Yeah.
And so really just stealing miscellaneous items is a good way to get rich, which I think is fascinating. I love that is a viable option.
Looking at your... Sorry, go ahead, Jackimoff.
Oh, yeah, it's sort of... There was always that sort of fun that I found in a lot of CRPGs where being a thief was really rewarded with... You could just pick up a lot of... It wasn't very guided in that, there would be a chest in everyone's house that has all their valuables in it. You would go in and you would just pick stuff up off the walls and they would have some value to it. And it was always fun to just go in and, see what this person had. Whereas... now that sort of thing is lost. If you go in, there'll be a lot of set dressing, but there won't be a lot of things that you can actually that painting looks expensive. Can I take it off the wall? No. Okay. So I think being a thief in these games is something that I just miss, I guess.
Yeah, the early days of D&D, the joke was you went into a location, grabbed everything that wasn't nailed down, then you came back with a crowbar to take everything that was nailed down.
Something we don't have to do in Morrowind. All the wooden spoons are available from the get-go.
So kind of moving on to the next slide, how does Morrowind fit into this dichotomy? Which side of the spectrum does it lay on? And I think, as I mentioned in the first slide, it's kind of in the middle. It certainly has strong characters more important than player mechanics. And this is something that really bothers people about the combat system, is they can't seem to understand that you, the player, can be attacking a monster, but your character is really bad with weapons. And I think that is maybe the main reason why I love Morrowind combat more than other games, is because it feels like my character is getting better at combat over time. Which is great. However, Morrowind does have very few meaningful choices, and ultimately you cannot impact the story whatsoever, other than deciding to kill Vivek and go down the back path. You really can't do much other than choosing your house, I guess. Now, can modders fix this? Yes, it is possible. Morrowind has all the tools necessary to make it a true CRPG with everything that you would ever imagine. It would take a lot of work. Things like Great House Dagoth or the pacifism mod that I believe Superstar made started adding a ton of different routes to the game. I know the pacifism mod especially is one of my favorites. I think it almost did every quest that required combat, allowed you to either like use the calm spell or a paralysis spell or talk to the NPC. Like if you, instead of killing a bandit, you could like convince them to leave or arrest them or something.
Throw money at them.
Fascinating. Yeah. Yeah. So I think that the construction set does give anyone the potential to add more RPG and tabletop game elements to Morrowind. It's just a lot of work. Now, the one maybe contentious topic is adding skill checks to Morrowind. Vanilla does not really do this outside of a very small number of events. But you can. There are mods that do a lot of skill checks. I know Tamriel Rebuilt is not one of them intentionally, but you could have a ton of dialogue options, where you can just check their alchemy skill and have the different quest rewards based on that, or you could check their strength to see if you can break open a door. You could add all these kind of tabletop staples of player actions and add it to Morrowind.
That's something that I like to do, but in the background. So there's a dialogue, and I will write 2, 3, 4 different answers. One if the strength is really high, one if the speechcraft is really high. So the answer is, oh, you know what? I don't want to mess with you. Okay, here, take it. If the player has high strength. Or, okay, I don't want to upset you because you're my superior if I checked for the rank in a faction, things like that. So I do them in the background. Because yes, the idea of adding a speechcraft 20 or anything like that is super appealing for me, because it feels like the way I have played and the way I have built my character matters at this point. But I understand also that because it's nowhere else in the game, it can break immersion as well. What's your take on that, guys?
I think it's really valuable to add that. I know why Tamriel Rebuilt doesn't do it, and we've got our reasons for that, but in terms of independent mods, I definitely would include it every time. It's just as a way of reinforcing that my character is improving. Mentality is that as your character's stats increase, you should naturally be able to use those stats to open up more opportunities to do things with them. And just opening up entire new avenues of completing quests is a really, really rewarding way of rewarding your choices of character progression and how much more powerful your character was, before they started this quest, and they wouldn't have been able to do that.
Yeah, you wouldn't want to lock off progress in the quest because you don't have a particular skill, but I can see something I've wanted to do is have little bonuses based on your skills, like you're engaging in dialogue with an NPC, getting information about the quest, and if you have illusion over a certain amount, a little message pops up. This person feels like this person may be under the influence of a charm spell. What they're telling you may not be entirely reliable.
That's a brilliant example. I mean, just one of the quests I was reviewing the other day, it had just a little speech check. It was you had to convince a guy to get out of the bath, and one of the regular way of solving it was to you break into the heating room in the bathhouse, turn off the heat, so he naturally wants to get out, and then you can tell him to go home. But you had the option, if your speechcraft was high enough, to just convince him to leave, and that just felt like you are using the tools that you've built up as you made your character to find an alternate solution, not the solution. You shouldn't be locked out of solving the quest entirely, but it felt really rewarding to just have that sort of alternate solution that I got because I had built my character this way.
I think that as far as Morrowind questing goes, I think that the shortcut method of skill checks is probably the easiest, second easiest way of implementing skill checks. So I think that there's the way that Danae mentioned where you get did you mention this? Where you get like a different reward based on your skills. So
so for clicking on the choice, whatever the choice is, there are 4 answers to that, depending on the character, skill, and attributes.
It doesn't even need to be that. As I say, like, it doesn't need to be particularly consequential. It could be that the dialogue just ultimately leads to the same.
It's just flavor.
This guy talks to you differently because you're really strong or you're really good with a sword or etc.
Now, I really like that because I love the approach where the player doesn't necessarily have to initiate the skill check. So I think that the not Morrowind way to do it would be kind of how Fallout New Vegas does it, where you have a skill check as a choice. It says endurance check, and you click on it, and then you have to just either see if you meet the requirement or know ahead of time via save scumming that you meet the requirement to see if you successfully pass the check. I think that the approach where you automatically get a response based on your character works a lot better with Morrowind.
There's sort of hidden skill check almost.
Yes. Yeah. Now there's an even kind of hybrid method between the two that I think I covered in the Morrowind scripting talk. Whenever I do these kinds of skill checks where a choice only works for the player if they exceed a skill, I will script the results box to only give them the option if theoretically they could do that. For example, if it's we'll say a barter check, like you're trying to convince someone, an NPC, that you know more about business than them. Someone with low mercantile skill wouldn't have the option, but someone with high mercantile skill suddenly sees that choice appear as an option. Yeah. I think that kind of sidesteps it a little bit in making it more Morrowind-like well, making it more tabletop game-like and more Morrowind-like without necessarily sacrificing one or the other.
To sort of respond to what Detailed Devil said in the chat, it's less about they would know your alchemy skill by just looking at you. It's more that you, as Mort said, you would have more dialogue options because of your knowledge of alchemy. You know, someone would say, "Oh, I'm going to make a potion using these ingredients," and because your alchemy skill is high enough, you can say, "Hold on, that would make a poison." Well, you know, something like that.
So I think that thinking of video game implementations of tabletop mechanics like skill checks, I think games like Fallout New Vegas, as much as I love Fallout New Vegas, I think it does a very bad job. Simply because it encourages save scumming. It tells you ahead of time when you talk to the NPC, you must meet this requirement to get the quote-unquote good option. If you talk to an NPC and it says, "Oh, you're 74 out of 80 gun skill for this option," you may as well save before you talk to every NPC, go level up some more gun skill, and then come back and get the good option. By hiding them, I think that is a good option, or simply not even telling the player that it's a skill check is an even better option.
Go ahead.
There's also options again to, you can even tie it behind things that aren't even skills. For example, in The Hand, how the Daedric creature will speak to you, there's quite a few checks that are based on how many times you've actually resisted its influence. So whether you try to take the gauntlet off at any point, it will speak to you as if you're a little bit more defiant. And I really like to try and tie them directly to the player's actions. And introduce reactivity in that way.
Yeah, that's great. Also, when is the second part of that mod?
It's getting work done.
I was going to say, so I think it was Pathfinder Kingmaker that I was playing a while ago, I think. There were skill checks and dialogues, but they would give you the option and you would know that you were going to fail, but you could just select it to see what happens if you try to bully them even though you're super weak. And I found myself clicking on those. There were no terrible consequences. It was just dialogue. But I actually enjoy those, like allowing the player to choose to fail a skill check.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that going back to tabletop games, that's exactly kind of what happens when you roll too low. The game doesn't end. For the most part, your GM isn't going to automatically kill you for talking to an NPC wrong, but you still know what happens.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good, tabletops tend to be very fail-forward, whereas video games by their very nature kind of have to be, if you fail, then you just don't get this content. Which is why the Fallout New Vegas method doesn't necessarily work, because you're not just immersively not being good at guns, you are just losing content. You're just missing out on stuff, which doesn't feel as rewarding as just messing up a roll in a TTRPG.
Yeah, I agree with a tabletop. The DM will make sure that you are rewarded for good interaction rather than the right thing to do, or the shortest path, the best path, the optimum path. A game, well, it's hard for a game to plan that, I guess. In the previous slide, you had the forced path, and I would argue that, okay, Morrowind has quest, main quest, and faction quest, and all that, but I would say that it's one of the strengths of Morrowind that you may completely ignore any and all paths given to you and go on your merry way and do what you want.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. No path is still a path. And I think being able to choose the order in which you do things is still a meaningful choice, even if it isn't narratively interesting. Being able to kind of fill in the gaps of role-playing a character in Morrowind is certainly very appealing.
Though one of the things that really feels missing in Morrowind is the consequences of moral choices taking you in different directions. I mean, you have the choice of whether to go with support the Thieves Guild or the Fighters Guild, or the two sides you can choose in Raven Rock, or whether to become a werewolf or have yourself cured. But I'm pretty sure that's about it.
That kind of leads me nicely into this of how can modders better emulate tabletop games in Morrowind? What are the kind of empty gaps that would need to be filled by modders? And as Armitage brings up, choices are a big one. If you were to take existing vanilla quest lines and introduce additional choices or additional routes and branching around it, you've made a much more interesting RPG. And I know there are certainly mods out there that do this. There are, I want to say, like, there's one for the Legion, there's one I think for the Thieves Guild or the Mages Guild. There's a few people actually trying to do this kind of thing for vanilla quest lines, which is fantastic. Additionally, and I think this is the big one, is the one in the very center. You want to see the world impact. It's more than just simply ranking up in a guild or finding a different route around things. You want to see when your character is helping people out or killing Vivek. I would love to see the world actually change as a result. As far as I know, there's really only one mod that has ever approached a post-game of Vivek dying, and that's Vivek's Fate by Brother Juniper. Fantastic mod. Also, I think it turns 22 or 23 years old this year. So, one of the first, I guess, big quest mods that I can ever remember existing, and actually nails it and tries to show how the temple would react to Vivek being killed.
I mean, for starters, if I kill Vivek, I want to see the little moons dropping on Vivek Temple.
Absolutely, I want someone to make that mod.
Well, I think it will require scripting, so not it.
There are some mods off the top of my head that add new quests with moral choices. Like Spicorny's house mod, Yorick's Tower, has an optional quest plugin with it. And early in the quest, you can either be the good guy and eventually fight the villain who's in control of the tower, or you can be the bad guy and end up working for him instead.
Well, that's great. We need more quests like that, and I wish that someone would just make one recommended mod list that added these kind of quests to the entire game. It would be awesome to play a game where every choice you do matters. You could even go so far as to lock you out of different quest lines and make it so that your individual character choices matter. Like, for example, joining the Mages Guild. I don't know, maybe, I guess you'd still want to join House Tilvani, but it would be cool to have that kind of antagonistic relationship between factions like you would in a tabletop RPG. Certainly, your DM isn't going to let you join every faction just because you want to.
I think that's what Lucifer's mod does, where indeed joining a faction will make it not impossible to join another one, but harder to join. And I can't think of the name right now, but something factions. Look it up. Speaking of the...
You join the Fighters Guild and then House Redoran says, we don't want mercenaries, go away.
Exactly. Yeah. That's the one. World impact, what I like to do in my mod, I can't make a moon crash on Vivek, but I like to do those little things where the NPC asks for a quill and inkwell and paper so they can write their journal, and then once you do that, the quill, the inkwell, and the paper appears on the table there. And I do add those all the time because it It makes me happy. It makes sense to me. But at the same time, I'm fairly certain that it's something that is not going to be noticed by most players. But it is possible to have things being enabled and disabled depending on what happens.
There was one old Quest mod I downloaded. I wish I knew which one, but you gave the NPC a lot of money, and the next time you saw them, they had nicer clothing.
I like that.
It was fascinating.
It was Gaynor 2.0, basically.
Yeah.
We did that quite a lot when we were making, just Tiny joinings just reminded me, we're doing Yilmashi, we made that pretty central to the goal of that quest line, in that whenever you picked up, whenever you brought back to her a new piece of the airship, if you went down into the basement and saw it, you'd see that she's installed that bit, and we've the airship itself, you could see it getting slowly built as you complete the quests. But additionally, we had little side objectives where you could pick up like something of I think there was like a little some Dwemer designs, and if I remember rightly, there was a sort of bust statue as well. And if you brought them back to Yul, she'd start decorating her house with them, which I just really liked. I really liked seeing that sort of visual representation of your progress.
Mm. And sorry, go ahead, Mort.
I was just going to say, talking about details that nobody is likely to actually notice. In one of my dungeon mods, it's full of hostile monsters, hostile NPCs, but the human NPCs have dialogue revealing that they've been brainwashed by the main villain and don't even remember how they got there. But it's only accessible if you happen to cast Calm on the enemies and then talk to them, and who's going to bother doing that during a normal game?
But it's the fact that it's there. Just I love that sort of. Oh, I can't believe they thought of that moment. You know, like I think one of the earliest quests I contributed to TR was you had to use a plant poison to go and kill the plants on this Hlalu guy's plantation. And I made it so that the quest giver actually reacts to if you just drink the poison. He just says, like, why on earth would you do that? Leave me alone, I don't want to talk to you anymore. And I like adding those little sort of details to quests that I make.
Yeah, I love those, because granted, out of 10 players, there might be only one that actually sees that. But that one player is gonna have so much enjoyment out of it, like, I found this little gold nugget of thing. So I'm okay with it. Yeah, most players will miss it, but those who don't are gonna be so happy they did.
Yes. So my last slide is the opposite of this. If this is how can modders put tabletop RPG elements in Morrowind, how can tabletop players play Morrowind on tabletop? So this is a character sheet from Call of Cthulhu. And I think if you were to pick a single system that kind of best emulates the Morrowind mechanic system, this is going to be it. So what you do is, it's a D100 system. Of course, no one actually owns a 100-sided die, so instead you roll 2 D10s, one of them being the tens digit, one of them being the ones digit. Your goal, when you have all this filled out, is to roll under the number. So if you have a higher skill, if you want to roll, for example, a stealth check, you would roll your dice. If you roll a 60 and your skill is a 70, it's a success. And I think you could probably translate all of the Morrowind skills being a 100 base system. You could translate that to this and essentially just play the same game. Of course, you could also go to the OpenMW research wiki and write down all of the specific math that Morrowind uses, because it does use a D100 system, and calculate every single hit from there, which would be fascinating and also miserable. Or you could just play Call of Cthulhu. I know. I'll ask Taniquidil. Did you use like 5th edition for your D&D setting? What? Just translated the setting over more or less. I'm curious because I've heard of people playing Morrowind in tabletop in the past. I think it's actually fairly popular. Elder Scrolls as a setting.
There was actually a tabletop Morrowind / D&D. I think mostly a modified D&D system. I forgot the name, but it's been around for a while. Let me try to look it up.
I'm mostly interested in how you translated. Did you translate any of the Elder Scrolls magic system?
Players spend hours in front of the spell creator, min-maxing every single attribute.
One of the things about Call of Cthulhu, or the more generic basic role-playing system, is that characters have a fixed pool of magic points that fuel their spells, which is similar to what you already have in Morrowind.
I've toyed with trying to do it in the Worlds Without Number system, just because that magic system is extremely flexible, so could be pretty easy to translate certain spells, most spells over. But I think the world of the Elder Scrolls definitely works as is really, really good for use as a backdrop of a TTRPG. Especially since you can sort of inject that reactivity that's sort of lacking within the games into a very, very fleshed out world, and it's a really good sort of marriage of the two concepts, I think.
I find the idea of a tabletop Morrowind RPG really, really interesting because, well, I love the game, but, back to the theater of the mind, it's very easy. I've run around Vardenfell so many times that if you tell me you arrive in Aldrin, you're facing a giant crab, I will see it.
Yeah.
So that's good. That's really good for me.
Wow, sure enough, the link that you posted has all of the everything you'd ever want in a tabletop RPG, at least for 5th edition.
Yeah, I did take a look at it, and I didn't find Morrowind very much in it, but I didn't read everything. There's the race, and they made effort for the lore, but it feels more D&D than Morrowind, which is fair.
Yeah.
Okay. Are there other things that we could take from our favorite tabletop RPGs and we could inject in Morrowind to make it even better?
Well, just at the most basic is mining them for ideas.
Yep.
I mean, in Morrowind, unless you're going through the Clockwork City, traps are really boring.
Mm-hmm.
You have magical effects on doors and chests and... yawn. There's no real scripted traps with animated objects or anything like that. But you look at D&D and some of the example traps in there, and they're a lot more interesting and involved than the basic Morrowind traps.
I agree.
Just a simple pitfall. That's all I ask.
Yeah. I mean, in this way, Oblivion did something way, way better than Morrowind, even though in Oblivion the traps got old very quickly, but at first it was really refreshing.
Well, now, I will argue that they did traps, but they made it very player-focused. Your character doesn't have a sense traps ability. It's all up to you, the player, to pay attention and look for the little tripwire, which... technically makes the traps more interesting, but it makes it kind of less of an RPG in that way.
Yeah, I didn't mind that. Like, I triggered them quite often. I went, oh, duh, stupid me, I should have paid attention instead of running to pick up that mushroom. I think that was good. My biggest problem with the traps in Oblivion, I think, was the lack of variety.
Everyone had a lot of logs for some reason. There were a lot of logs in that game.
Yeah, how did they get them in there?
Yeah, Archimaestro and Terry's had some interesting traps in his mod Dungeon and Diamond, and I'll admit I stole a couple of them for one of my mods.
So did we.
Crossbow bolt flying across the room at the player and a jet of flame shooting out of a wall.
Yeah.
I stole those from that mod.
We used them for Ebonheart Underwork, and because Abbott was on the team, he took a look at the scripts and he improved them and made them better. So we had pitfalls, we had projectile shooting across the room, that sort of things. I would love to see more of that in Morrowind.
Yes, I think definitely in terms of things that modders should emulate, making the dungeons themselves more interesting is great, because right now, at least in base Morrowind, they're just very large treasure chests with monsters in them. You go in, you occasionally kill some things, and you collect the loot. And it's up to the modders to actually add in traps and quests within the dungeons, and things other than just simply trapped doors.
That actually ties into shifts in what we've seen in tabletop RPG adventures. I mean, in the early days of D&D, it was almost entirely site-based adventures. Here's a dungeon, go in, kill everyone, take their stuff. Which, as you just said, pretty much describes Morrowind dungeons. But over time, event-based adventures started becoming more popular, where they would be set in a city or a forest or wherever, but the focus was on the events that were happening at that location and the event and how the player was reacting to them.
And
now, these days implementing that sort of thing, it's more complicated because you have to include compatibility patches for beautiful cities of Morrowind and all the other city overhauls. But there don't really seem to be as many mods that are focusing on things that are happening as opposed to going to a particular place.
I was going to say, though, we have a new trend of dungeon mods where we don't focus on what is happening, but we do have visual clues as to what happened, and we get a bit of storytelling there. And so, yes, you're still in there to kill stuff and loot, but you're also there to explore, like genuinely explore, rather than go to the last room where there's going to be a boss, maybe. So we're going in the right direction, I think.
Yes, definitely.
Mm-hmm. If there was a better way to increase the reward of exploration in a character rather than player focused way, that's sort of what we should be looking to move towards, I would say.
Mm. You know, a mod like The Hand, where the story, like there is a story, but most quests you would have the quest giver telling you, well, this is my problem, this is what I need. You travel to a place and then do the thing and then come back. What I really loved with The Hand is that I felt that the story was ongoing every step of the way. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And that's what I love in dungeons with ProfArmitage's mods. I love the idea that, yes, I'm progressing through a dungeon, but I'm also progressing through a story. And that's what I would love to see in the dungeons. Dungeons telling me a story, or, I don't know, some stories in my dungeons. That's what I want.
That was sort of the goal with the hand, was to make it sort of thrust the player into this narrative and just make it continually evolve as they explore through the dungeons. To go to these locations, because it is very much, if you pare it all back, it's very much just a pretty standard go to this location, activate the activator, and come back to this other location and kill a guy. But I think you can make that more narratively interesting without putting that much more flashy scripting into it. I think that focusing on that is pretty important for making sure that there's choices within your quests.
I agree. I find more and more when I try to make a quest, I don't care so much about the quote-unquote reward at the end of a quest. The other day somebody was asking, I finished Halls of the Colossus. What's next? Oh, that's it? So, but what's my reward? Well, your reward is you get back to Vardenfell and you know a couple of spells, but I feel that the story is more a reward than any loot you can get.
I thought the powers you get were pretty powerful, so I wouldn't complain about that either.
Yeah. Well, it's a cool one. But yeah, Sarah Shanks, there's no reward. I mean, the reward is you can sleep in that pretty bedroom upstairs, which you could do, in vanilla anyway. But I liked it that way. The reward was going through the stories and the rumors and everything. And I like that more and more.
Yeah, it's like the mod I threw together for the very first mod jam. Rescue the kidnapped merchants. Your reward is their dispositions all go up to 100, so you get better prices from them.
Yep.
Plus whatever loot the new villain was carrying.
Yeah. Detail is asking in the chat, what's your stance on 1, creating many quest mods, or 2, creating one long and highly detailed quest mod?
Ideally, you would have both. You have to pick one.
But taking into account that there's only 24 hours in a day, which one?
I don't think there's a right answer to that. I think that you make the quest that you want to make. If you have many interesting ideas that can be executed quickly, then you would make many little quest mods. I think a quest should be as long as the idea is interesting, I think.
I'll sidestep the question entirely and say, just make a good quest. Good quests aren't necessarily complex quests. There are many complex quests that are bad. There are many quests with a ton of choices and a ton of branching that is all completely meaningless and only makes the quest kind of more annoying to play. And there are plenty of simple quests that are very memorable and fun to play. So I'd say focus on making it good, but don't feel required, like you have to make it branching to be good. It can make it more interesting, and if you set out to intentionally make a quest that has a lot of complex branching and detail to it, that it can be good when done correctly.
And honestly, there is space in the game for both. If you take a mod like a Fresh that adds some 30 plus quests, and they're all fairly simple, but because you kind of stumble on them as you're traveling from one place to another, that definitely adds to the world. On the other hand, if you have a bigger quest mod, more involved and more detailed, this is also good. So both, I agree with Mort. We want both.
Because I'd like to do both. I mean, everything that I've done so far has been smaller, self-contained adventures. But what I would love to do at some point is try to do adaptations of the 3 quest paths that Paizo published in Dungeon Magazine. These were 3 big quest lines. Each one was like 12 or 13 separate adventures that linked together to tell one huge story that was designed to take the players from level 1 to level 20 or more. And these were huge adventures, and I honestly don't know if I have the skill or time to do them, but I think they'd be fun to try.
Yeah.
And there is a way. There's another way that you can do both. Is that you can do something fairly similar to, if you remember, Oblivion, Simyaz's quests. Ruined Tale's Tale and etc. Where each one came out as a standalone. He obviously got more and more elaborate as he went on, but each one came out originally as a standalone, pretty tightly written quest, which he then created. I think it was called Tears of the Fiend, which was a sort of capstone that tied off all of the narratives of the individual quest lines that he'd made, and was very, very reactive to which one of those you actually completed. So there were certain characters who would only appear if you'd completed one or the other. Certain characters, it would react to whether or not you killed certain characters within the quest lines, and I thought that was a really, really interesting way of doing it, one that I'd quite like to emulate once I've got a few more mods under my belt.
Yeah, that sounds great. All right. Anything else we want to add on the topic? We've covered quite a few things thanks to that wonderful PowerPoint. Thank you for that, Mort.
You're welcome.
Now, I think I'm going to have to invite you to absolutely every single talk, fully expecting a PowerPoint. But seriously, though, anything else you want to add on the topic, guys?
I think it's an interesting topic to think about. It kind of makes me want to play Morrowind in a tabletop RPG now, more than I did before.
True. And I think beyond tabletop RPG, looking at other games, video games, even board games, we can definitely find little things. Go, you know what? That would work pretty neatly in Morrowind, and then implement that. Mm-hmm. So play games.
My second biggest problem in making mods, the biggest being maintaining the motivation to finish it, is coming up with an idea in the first place. Mm. And I've mentioned in the past that I have a spreadsheet I put together with all of the adventures that were published in Dragon Magazine and Dungeon Magazine from first edition to the end of third. There are almost 700 adventures that they published just in the magazines. So there are lots and lots of ideas there that could be stolen, borrowed, mined, whatever you want to call it.
Yeah.
Implemented, updated to a newer platform. Translated, yes.
Yeah, that's the one.
That's a good one. Yeah. Well, 700, you say. I'm looking forward to playing all of them. All right. Thank you so much for the talk. That was fun. We should do that again.
Yeah.
Tomorrow around the same time, Johnny Hostile and Sector have a tutorial/workshop on how to install Morrowind, MWSC, and CSSC on Linux. So this is going to be probably a little more technical, but if you're interested, please tune in and listen to that talk. Next month there is going to be another talk. The topic hasn't been picked yet. It depends on who's available and who's interested, but I will put the details in MMC as soon as I have them. Until then, what do we say? Happy Morrowinding? Happy modding?
Happy Morrowinding.
Happy Morrowinding.
Okay.
Happy Morrowinding.
Happy Morrowinding. Oh, that's a tongue twister. Happy Morrowinding, everyone. Talk to you soon.
Goodbye.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.